They say the hardest borders are not drawn on maps, but inside the mind. Most of us spend our days living not from our own convictions, but from an imagined audience, adjusting our words, choices, and even desires to secure approval and avoid rejection. 20th century psychologist Alfred Adler argued that people suffer not from events themselves, but from the meanings they attach to them. Every day, we sentence ourselves to silence because we imagine the courtroom of other people's opinions. On social media, likes, comments, and views have become visible markers of social acceptance. We have unconsciously learned to read these markers as proof of being seen, valued, and permitted to exist within the digital community. When engagement is high, there is relief. When it is low or absent, there is anxiety, as though silence itself were a quiet rejection. Have you ever considered that your silent fear, the fear of being disliked, may be costing you far more than the momentary comfort you seek? A single encounter with Kishimi and Koga's ideas, based on adlerian psychology, would make you realize that this is a battle you are quietly losing. In avoiding confrontation and disagreement, and saying yes when you inwardly mean no, you may believe you are preserving harmony or pleasing others. Yet in doing so, you gradually surrender your own freedom, authenticity, and self-respect. The question, then, is not whether this fear exists, but how one begins to loosen its grip. To have the courage to be disliked, you first need to learn how to separate tasks. Distinguish between your own task and other people's tasks. Kishimi and Koga explain that much of our fear in interpersonal relationships arises from crossing this boundary, taking responsibility for other people's feelings, reactions, and evaluations. Let's say you have been invited by a friend to a weekend outing, but you feel you need rest or solitude. You therefore reasonably decline the invitation, but then spend minutes justifying it so that your friend won't feel upset. In this case, you need to understand that your decision to rest or stay alone is your task. On the other hand, your friend's disappointment is their task. By over-explaining, you're trying to manage their emotional response, which is their task. Kishimi and Koga remind us that our life belongs to us alone because no one else can step in and live it for us. Thus, when you concern yourself with how your friend will judge you for declining their request, you have already abandoned your own life and begun living your friend's life. You should understand that, ultimately, the consequences of choosing rest rather than going out will be experienced by you alone, not by your friend. When you accept that your task is to live according to your values and that others are free to judge or misunderstand, you reclaim your freedom and live a more honest and authentic life. You need to understand that the courage to be disliked is not the absence of conscience, but the refusal to let misunderstanding, criticism, and approval replace your commitment to what is genuinely good. Socrates argued that no one desires evil for its own sake. People act as they do because they believe, rightly or wrongly, that their actions serve some good. When individuals commit harmful acts and persist despite criticism, it is not because they value evil, but because they are convinced their actions benefit them. This explains why some figures in our society, including manipulative politicians, appear immune to disapproval. They are firmly committed to what they believe is beneficial to them, regardless of moral truth. From this perspective, the lesson is not to imitate their immorality, but to recognize the source of their psychological resilience. Such individuals are not limited by public judgment because their actions are anchored in a strong internal conviction, however distorted it may be. They do not seek permission from others to act. In this sense, they demonstrate a form of the courage to be disliked, although directed towards self-serving or destructive ends. Socratic wisdom demands that we redirect this courage toward the true good, not abandon it altogether. To have the courage to be disliked is to act in accordance with reasoned moral understanding rather than social approval. When you are clear about what is right, criticism loses its power to destabilize you. Unlike thieves, politicians, and murderers who persist in wrongdoing out of ignorance, A Socratic individual accepts disapproval knowingly, not because they are indifferent to others, but because they refuse to abandon truth, responsibility, and self-governance for the comfort of being liked. In a conflict resolution meeting, whether you are representing your team, family, business partners, or fellow workers, it is entirely possible for one of your colleagues to offer an opinion that is warmly received by your rivals. If you recognize that this opinion ultimately disadvantages your side, disagreeing with it may immediately cast you as the difficult one. At that moment, the temptation is to doubt yourself simply because approval has shifted away from you. However, Adlerian psychology makes it clear that approval is not a moral compass. Praise from rivals does not necessarily signal goodness or correctness. It often signals alignment with their interests. When opponents praise someone as a good person only because that person's stance benefits them, they are engaging in recognition as a tool of influence. If you allow that praise to shake your conviction, you have crossed the boundary of tasks, allowing others to define your worth and decisions. To have the courage to be disliked in such moments is to remain grounded in your responsibility rather than their reactions. Your task is to advocate honestly and responsibly for those you represent, not to secure admiration from the opposing side. As the book, The Courage to be Disliked emphasizes, freedom requires accepting the cost that others may misunderstand, criticize, or dislike you. When you can hold your position calmly without hostility and without craving validation, you demonstrate genuine courage. History shows that some controversial figures appear to master being disliked by repeatedly engaging in behavior that makes others uncomfortable until the public grows accustomed to it. Over time, outrage fades, familiarity sets in, and in some cases, such individuals are rewarded with attention, influence, or even political power. According to adlerian psychology, when a person is no longer shaken by criticism, they gain psychological stability. Many people, by contrast, abandon their values at the first sign of disapproval. However, controversial figures often persist, not because they are morally right, but because they are unconcerned with being liked. This unconcern allows them to act decisively and consistently, while others hesitate, over-adjust, or withdraw in fear of judgment. The lesson, then, is not to imitate scandal or mediocrity, but to reclaim the inner independence that such controversial figures possess. To have the courage to be disliked is to stop outsourcing your sense of worth to public opinion. It is to accept that criticism, misunderstanding, and even hostility are inevitable when you act from conviction. As Kishimi and Koga argue, freedom in human relationships requires paying the price of being disliked. The ethical task is to ensure that this freedom is used in service of integrity and contribution rather than manipulation or self-promotion. You can also have the courage to be disliked by placing community feeling and contribution above the desire for recognition. Resist the temptation to seek approval because you want reassurance that you matter. You need to understand that recognition is a fragile substitute for genuine self-worth, since it depends entirely on others' judgments. Work on shifting your focus from being seen to being useful. Community feeling is not about earning praise or admiration, but about holding the quiet conviction that I am of use to someone, whether or not anyone acknowledges it. When contribution becomes your guiding principle, disapproval no longer feels like rejection of your worth. You understand that others may disagree with you, misunderstand you, or even dislike you, and yet your contribution remains intact. In this way, you solely act to fulfill your role responsibly within the community,